It is finally time to welcome back Polina Sadovskaya from Pan America and two more poets and translators, Mónica De La Torre and Ivan Sokolov, who have just joined us, or rather Polina, for a conversation about translation involving, I think, some of our poets already here.
Thank you so much again for your incredible loyalty and patience. Only Yasha Klotz can make his guests to learn how much loyalty, patience, and adoration they have for his topics. But we are together, and now to the last sentence about untranslatability of poetry. It's a wonderful bridge for our conversation about poetry and translation today. And also I would like to mention here a sentence that Ilya Kaminsky gave me, I don't know, lifetime ago, that actually we translate because it's impossible. Let it be our epigraph today.
Fantastic. This is so much better than to say that translating poetry is stupid, because so first of all, I want to start this with extending my huge thanks to Yasha, who just disappeared, no? Where is he? Okay, so I'll keep this for myself until Yasha is back, because really it is thanks to him that we are having this conversation here today. So it was extremely important for me to have this discussion about the project that is called Your Language, My Ear project, and we will come back to the title of it a little later. Because it was a good 2 years of my life, this project, and not the most calm 2 years of my life, and probably a lot of people can attest. It started actually way before by another great partner, Kevin Platko from University of Pennsylvania, who couldn't be here today, but I just wanted to say that too. So in 2021, we managed to find quite a significant amount of money to support this project. And together with Kevin, with Polina, with Mark, we created this little expert group to dream about what we can do about poetry and translation with this money. And we thought, okay, we can just get all these Russophone poets to America, to New York, to Pennsylvania, to Texas, where Pan America has also a great chapter. And then connect them with translators, and create a book. Then the second year, we will bring all these American poets to Moscow. We connected with Peredelkina and already started planning amazing events there, how we will be gathering there in the woods. And then we received the money in the end of 2021. And just a few months after happened what you all know what happened. The full-fledged Russian war in Ukraine started. And I'll speak to myself, but I'm sure everyone has stories. It took me a few months to even have some sort of recovery from this. And of course, much more time needed to rethink the project, because basically we found ourselves in the interesting situation. On one hand, no one wanted to hear anything about anything Russian. On the other hand, the project of translating the poetry that is written right now in Russian language became even more important than before. And and during this time, together with all the great people who were involved, we came up with some solution. So we could not do it in the United States anymore. The visa for people with a Russian passport were almost impossible. And so we found the partner, the great partner in Armenia, who is a president of Pan Armenia there, and we decided to host both trips with Russian poets and American translators and vice versa in Yerevan. And we went even then. We still went through a lot. I remember how we were sitting in this like beautiful setting, Armenian setting, and the attempted coup happened in Russia. And we had to even think about through some emergency plan for those people who had to go back to Russia, whether they actually can now. And all this was happening in the midst of translation, in the midst of, you know, it was just really awkward, at least to me. So we, fortunately, or I don't know, unfortunately, good question, this coup didn't last long. And I mean, we had to continue living the life we were living, and the book is coming up. The book that will include the results of this translation after the 2 years of work, hopefully will come up soon, so check it out. These are my impressions of this project. I just want to hear yours. This would be my question to all of you.
I think you forgot that we had a really good party on the night of the coup. My impression of, so professionally as a translator, so I've been with this project forever since it began. So I guess a dozen years now. And I watched it, so the basic idea is it's collective translation. So it's not one-on-one, but it's done in groups, usually fairly small groups, where not everybody speaks the language of the original, although most people do, and where there are poets in both languages, there are translators, you know, working in both directions. Sometimes there are also scholars, students, blah, 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 blah. Very different people working very closely together over a whole number of sessions. The last sessions were basically, we worked for a week together, and that's a lot. And it became a tremendously powerful way of translating the untranslatable, with versions, and I mean, I've been in this project both as translator and as poet who was being translated. And so, I mean, as poet, I can say that the precision and at the same time the poetic beauty of the versions is extremely high, okay? So as a method of work, I mean, it is a very impressive and powerful method. So.
Is this working? Yes. My impressions are many. I was very fortunate to have been involved in a different project a few years before. I think it was 2018,
Right, and which actually, from at least Pan American side, kind of predicted what the so it was the beginning of it in a sense.
So I was being primed. So I was invited to go to Moscow to do some translation workshops based on some poems of mine. And I don't speak a word of Russian, unfortunately. Maybe I speak 2 words, but I will not demonstrate right now because I don't want to embarrass myself. But so when in Moscow, I would be sitting among a group of translators, 4 to 5 translators, who were working on my poetry, and I didn't understand a word of what they were saying. And often I would notice that it was a very short poem, and the conversation would go on for 30 minutes or 45 minutes, you know, and it was almost like a Talmudic conference. And I could see a lot of like passionate arguments and laughs, and it just like, so I was very receptive of the affect around the act of collective translation, but didn't understand a word. Luckily, I thought of recording the conversation and then have someone transcribe the conversation, and then I translated it, and then I learned a lot about translation when hearing them discuss this. So when I got invited to go to Yerevan, I was in a similar situation. My Russian had not improved. And I would, what was two very, very interesting impressions. The first was when my poems were not being translated, but the poems of a colleague were being translated. And I would be sitting there, not as an expert of the poet in question, but as someone who understood the original very well. And I couldn't follow the conversation in Russian, and I am bilingual, and my other language is Spanish. So what I would do in order to participate, to have something to contribute to the dialogue, was to try to translate the same poem that everybody was discussing into Spanish. And doing that into Spanish, I realized that the problems that they were discussing were the same problems I was encountering. With some exceptions, you know, of course there's idioms and everything, but it was extremely helpful and revelatory to realize that, yes, that when something becomes untranslatable, it's often because because something in the poem is happening that could only happen in that language. Like you don't notice that something's untranslatable. Say, for instance, people talk about idioms, right? And often idioms are the same, or they're not the same, but they're in the same universe. Like say, for instance, brainstorming is an idiom. In Spanish, we use lluvia de ideas. So it's not a storm. It's just rain, precipitation. It's very calm. It's not as aggressive. But you realize, oh, okay, same. You know, it's kind of like the same semantic field. But when it isn't, then you realize, whoa, that is so interesting because it reveals something about the mindset of the language or a sensibility that's not there. Of course, language works that way. Like we think things are equivalent and that there's a one-to-one correspondence, and until when it's proven that it doesn't, then you realize that the language is doing something very specific. So anyway, I learned a lot about that process. And I felt like I would say in these conversations, I would say, well, if I were doing this in Spanish, I would solve it by trying to find, and I felt perhaps a little too optimistically that often I did manage to contribute something that was useful to the other translators, even though, you know, we were solving different problems. And the other thing I noticed is that I don't realize that my poems resist translation. You know, to me they're completely transparent. And, you know, yeah, I'm like, that's a big deal. And then when I realized what they were doing, and seeing it through the lens of translation, I would realize that there were so many correspondences. They're like little systems where whatever appears at the beginning is tweaked, or you know, it's reworked in a different way. And there's all these, really it's like a system of correspondences that, of course, it reveals itself through the process of translation, and it's even a surprise to me. So those things. And I just want to say that the community that was built around this process, where we really did not do anything during the day, but sit around and discussed translation, was exquisite. I mean, it is a dream. It's like a utopian universe where the conversation we're having is precisely the only conversation that we are really good at and that we want to be having at that time. So it was just a gift. Really.
Two impressions as well. One, to second Monica's point. And I did not participate in the year part. I only joined in later during the online sessions. But I felt very acutely that a community was being formed and shaped during those discussions. A utopian community, or we call the community to come, something that does not exist, cannot exist, may be posited through the act of sharing and disagreeing. I'm a very particular kind of translator. I was trained as one. With all the attendant traumas, strictures, and criminal codes that come with the profession. I know exactly how things must be translated, and there's only one way. That's my training. And my entire life, I have tried to resist that in myself. So, when you encounter someone else, maybe as trained as you are, maybe not trained at all, you hate their guts. You hate every word they're saying, you hate every single suggestion that is coming from them. And yet you also understand how vital it is. So the work we're doing is, I think, fundamental, essential, necessary. This is the democratic structure of the aesthetic judgment in Fine Food, in a nutshell. A group of people disagreeing and coming to terms with that disagreement. For a common goal, maybe a goal not shared, maybe a heretical goal, maybe a subversive goal, maybe different goals. And yet, in that moment of disagreeing, in that moment of saying, let's not do that, or, okay, maybe I can live with that, really coming together for a split second. Second impression. Poetry and translatable. But also something that always must be translated, perhaps? Isn't the untranslatable that precisely which calls for translation? You go down the street and you see a homeless person. Are they translatable in your experience? Not at all. They're completely erased from your viewfield. But they must be part of it. Just like a poem in a different language also looks at you and wants to embrace you, wants you to embrace it, wants you to reject it. So there's something happening with the untranslatable. That's a very important word to me. I do agree that poetry is untranslatable, just as I believe that it must be translatable. How? Well, there's another idea. There's never not happening a single moment of translation when we're speaking. Eugene's poem today was just one of those moments that I sometimes think about when I think about that. The horrendous displacements, conflicts, disagreements, violence, encoded in very simple words, basic words, like the word beautiful. And what is so horrible about that word, beautiful, is one interpretation, someone who translated the poem. It's a centaur of a word, isn't it? It's a word that speaks to us of its Romance past and of its Germanic past. It's a word that remembers of countries that were colonized, of wars, of tribes embracing the language of one another or not embracing it, of different tribes carrying that Latin root, that Ella into something like book, bow, you're becoming in different versions, different pronunciations, carrying different shapes. Do we remember that when we say, you're so beautiful? Must we? So I do think that there is an instance of translation in discourse, speech, experience, and poetry may be the urgent site for that. And to illustrate that, and also to close my rambling, why don't we demonstrate? Monica, would you be so kind as to read a poem of yours? I'm putting you on the spot, but let us entertain it.
Oh, okay. Yes, okay. Like in Valencia, the silence of Esmeralda, the sorbet at the Café Superior, the oil at the dentist was relaxing. The two roads were doubly tragic. The serrano peppers caused me to take a long nap. The quantity of spectators was twice as large. The guy was a little slow on something. The two eels seemed like three. Three in space is guaranteed. Whoever is complacent with me is my friend. 3 books that have beards look grand in the sun. 4 as a number is nothing. 4 amuses too. 5 is a vessel, something to do with water. Water is the key to 5. Camel to camel, they like to eat green. This is no, it's not a homophonic translation. It's a misunderstood translation by someone who speaks very little Spanish, heard the poem in Spanish and repeated the lines, hearing what they heard, or saying what they heard.
There are a number of people in this room who practice what is called exophonic writing, or exophonic poetry, or exophonic translation, that is, translation writing into the language not your own, exotic to you. But then, of course, the question is, which language is your own? Is Russian my native language? What does that mean? How do I feel Russian? Do I feel it's equal? And homophonic translation really is one of those moments when we sense the strangeness, the foreignness, the intrusion of something else. Homophonic translation as in, you hear a word and you translate the form, not the content. You translate the sound, not the meaning. But maybe you also do. Here's what we did. And we worked, we sort of became very orthodox at it. So we went back to the Spanish quote-unquote original. And we were translating, this is a translation I'm reading, done by Polina Barskova, Tatiana Krasilnikova, myself, and Alexander Zakon. We translated it from Spanish without speaking most of the piece, without speaking a word of Spanish, but also sort of following this English poem that I remind you, Monica just confessed to us, is completely transparent into Russian. Echo валентности. Кунны, силенциум, ямарада. Озерное кафе. Античники суп ели морген.
Уныние внутри унного хера. Таскали нас парапланов траектории. Иисус, иссохла радость дура, мне надо сесть. Кайла тверды и в плесени люки. До сих и от сих я сон тряс. Тряс и спас, гарантирую. Он к полиции не мигая. Трясли и бросали трехгранную соль. Квадратный вечер, день в ноябре не надо. Квадратами ломится македоница. Неси же симку, вещая попрыгунья. Корягу, акын, и схему тукана. Вздыхал в Варде ветер.
Just to introduce again Mónica De La Torre and Vanya Sokolov. Couple of points about this project, especially about last 2 years of its existence, when I think its meaning or number of meanings changed drastically. First of all, it became obvious, at least to me, that one of the purposes was to shift, to flex the very idea of what is seen today as poetries written in Russian. I personally, for my idiosyncratic reasons, have issues with the word Russophone, but poetry is written in Russian, I'm fine with that. And one of our purposes was to bring together, in conversation, people who write poetries in Russian, people of different ethnic backgrounds, people of different, well, sexual preferences and beings, people of different ages, people of completely different stylistic preferences, and give this collection of people to their American interlocutors. And when we thought how to also, well, select these American creatures of poetry, this idea of wild difference was on our minds. Well, again, I rarely make a secret of this. This is one of my favorite Russian poets. He writes in English, but it's okay, as he said. So, and this is endlessly strange. Everything is strange about it. And this is how we wanted it, and this is one of our examples. And then, for example, we had Monica with her absolutely transparent poetry. And as I remembered, reminiscing today, that in the process of co-creating with a number of other translators this translation, I physically felt my brain kind of moving in my skull and trying to jump out. And perhaps it was one of the most, again, difficult exercises. So, this first point, poetries written in Russian today are so different, and our counterparts should know about this and should try to, I don't know, protract to it their fingers, computers, tongues, ears, whatever. Secondly, last 2 years presented us with every bad thing basically possible. For me, one of the most unbearable things was that understanding really suffered. Everybody, I suspect, in this room can think about their favorite examples. For me, the fact that on two sides of that very, I don't know, it's not an iron curtain anymore, but as I said in my poem, for me it's rather now a curtain of blood and shit. people really, as it's becoming more and more difficult to understand each other. And we all know situations of that, even when people want to understand. So on some level, for me, these laboratories now, as Vanya said, these are extremely trying, I don't know, laboratories of understanding. And I absolutely agree. Sometimes so much irritation becomes connected, involved in this process. But for me it was utopian, that at least there is an illusion that understanding can happen. And again, I know it sounds almost naive of me, but this is what we can do. Now, about what we can do, maybe it's cute, but I was absolutely, again, touched, struck by a movie. It's absolutely not her best movie, but it kind of undid me. I'm talking about a movie by Agnieszka Holland called Mr. Jones. I didn't know the story before, but Masha Gessen, who then taught in Amherst, where I lived, invited me to participate in her class on journalism, where he talked about Mr. Jones, a journalist who was the only journalist who, in 1933, decided to go to Ukraine and attempted to tell the world about his impressions. He failed, which is also interesting and significant. But that impression that it might take one person to create understanding, for example, of Holodomor, or anything that is happening today. So, on some level, I absolutely understand that what has been happening in this laboratory is precious. You know, poets working together, translating sometimes impossibly difficult, yes, beautiful, sometimes obviously ugly, I think very urgent poetry. But again, understanding happens on one or 10-to-10 ratio basis. And for me, this was some kind of model that this can happen. And again, there exists one volume, there will be another volume. I know that of many of these contacts, relationships started of translation. What happened in these weeks, people continued to translate each other and to read each other. These relationships continue. And now, when every relationship of understanding, I think, is incredibly important, I think this matters.
I like that the relationship, the community, already a few of our panelists mentioned it. I think it was, to my opinion, also a very important outcome of this. But back to the war, how the poetry, how the translation of poetry changed since the start of the war, its objective, its audience. And maybe it's a question again to everyone, but maybe Vanya, to you first, since you translate a lot of American poetry. What change for you after the worst?
Well, everything did, in the sense that writing changed, words changed. It took me quite some time to resume writing, to be able to resume writing in the aftermath of the full-scale invasion, and I will never forget that first sense of Greece, of unspeakable, indescribable Greece, growing on words. You grope and they just slip out. Everything is marred and everything carries this shell of violent discourse around it. But that was my own writing, but obviously it spilled over into everything else, into journalism, into lectures on art history. This infects everything. Translation too. How do you translate a sublime poem into the language of war? But second question, what do you translate? One of the things I was doing was go back, and I think this is a classic move. The present sweeps into the future, and we go back. We always go back. I went back to a signature work of American poetry, 1971, by the poet who left us but a few days ago, Jerome Rothenberg, a foundational figure of global writing. And I went back to a book of his called Poland 1931, which is a book of poems, I'm not the first, not the last to translate it into Russian, but that was just my way of dealing with whatever was happening around words. It's a book of poems written by an American poet, imagining the unknown history of his Jewish ancestors in the pre-war Poland. Importantly, 1931, so a few years out, right? It's just that hovering moment on the brink of everything changing, which was, of course, on everyone else's mind regarding the Russian history of the 2000s and the 2010s and the early 2020s. Where did we miss that flip point? Where did we miss the switch? Rothenberg's poem is precisely about that. It talks in its impossibly satirical, grotesque, fantastic way of the beautiful but also the horrendous life of the Jewish people in pre-war Poland. Holidays, loves, fights, violence, rapes, as a moment of that world that then was no more. And I think when I was working on those translations, that was the sense that I was trying to capture, that everything has changed, the words have changed. What we do, we go back and we recover. For me, that is the motion of the translator now. Recovery.
Another thing that changed is, well, this is not a change that happened with a full-scale invasion, but a change that happened more in 2014, although it intensified in 22. It's the necessity of translating Ukrainian material, right? Which is extremely under-translated into Russian, into English, and not just contemporary stuff, but also historical material. So this is something that Polina was doing for quite a while, right? And then, so I tried doing a few things into English of poetry, but also of prose, of modernist stuff that I'm kind of used to doing. So that became a big difference, right? You know, if you, one of the things that wars force upon you, or crises force upon you, in the context of translation and the context of literary study, is an understanding of the effect of certain absences, right? How maybe this kind of naive, idyllic idea that one has of translation is, you know, you pick a text and you translate it and blah, 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 and it's just you and the text. That idea is wrong. It's not just you and the text, right? What happens with translation is also a social event, right? Where the choice of what you're translating is actually at least as important as your virtuosity as a translator, right? And I think when I started translating, I just thought of it in terms of, I don't know, poetic skill, poetic craft, blah, 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 blah. But maybe, well, at least as important, and maybe even more important, is understanding of what exists out there that could be translated, should be translated, and peaking, right? So the curatorial aspect of the translation work, and maybe even curatorial / scholarly aspect of it, is at least as important as the poetic aspect.
I will say something, and then I will ask one last question of Mónica, whom I'm so happy to see again. This is perhaps weird and slightly obnoxious. It's what I want to do. I went to Amherst before now to spend some time with my daughter. And this is where I lived for 15 years and worked. And in the Pioneer Valley, I was incredibly lucky to be able to bring my favorite poets there. So I walked, again, Amherst is a town size of, I don't know, a caterpillar. So I walked all the time by the same building, and this was Izbushka na kurich nožkach, a beautiful tiny house, bed and breakfast, where I used to place my guests. And at some point, this is where I put Sergei Zhadan. And I somehow very vividly remember that week, and our conversations and his readings, and thought that this is the house, this is the lilac bush. Where is Zhadan? And what had happened? And we talked a lot about translation. And this is when I began losing my shame, thinking that maybe I can translate from Ukrainian. And he read a cycle called Suicide, Самоубийцы. And I began writing my cycle in conversation with Zhadan, but fully understanding that my version of translatio, carrying through, across, away, will be something different. And now when reading from this book, again, as I said, written mostly before 2022, it's weird. Самоубийцы. гуляя по Амхерсту Жадану. Цвейг, Петрополис, прачечный дух мышьяка. Хороша и нужна молодая жена для того, чтобы одеть и умыть старика перед тем, как в него перельется весна. Он себя полагает в холодную ночь, как в портер перед Малера жидкой строкой. Он ее укращает: подруга, не плачь. Смерть должна быть такой, с длинным торсом, с высокой шеей, с пятном на зеленом, как море, гнилое зрачке. Мы проснемся, и нету стыда, и во всем смысл прощения, свобода, и в каждом толчке крови голос стоит: возвращайся домой. На твоем языке, в угасании дня, смерть твоя, приподнявшись на смуглой руке, скажет: кончи в меня. And my question to Monica: so how does it feel to translate poetry that is connected to the world and country that is involved in such things?
Let me make sure I understand the question. How does it feel to translate from a country that is involved in such things? Meaning to translate into English?
Good question. I meant Russian.
You meant Russian? Okay,
Yeah.
I see. Okay. Well, I mean, yes. So, what does it feel to be translated into Russian?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, for me, my relationship to Russian, having grown up in Mexico, to Russian and Russian, the culture, and to Russia as this entity, having grown up in Mexico, is very important. Because it's historic, right? I mean, there's so much in Mexico that is connected to Russia. Mexican modernists, the muralist poets, Trotsky's house, his relationship with Frida Kahlo. I mean, even before you begin to understand these things, you already know them. You know them as a school kid. You read Dostoevsky. So to me, this connection that I feel really so absolutely fortunate to have made, thanks to the work of Polina and Matvey and all of you, is kind of like uncovering something that I knew was there, but I didn't ever experience an interest that went beyond what I thought I already knew. And so embarking on this path makes me realize how much I don't know and how much I could know, and all these things that I mean, like, just to give you an example, I've been doing research on a Mexican architect, Luis Barragan. Luis Barragan is considered the epitome of modernist architecture in Mexico. He and other collaborators of his named and wrote a manifesto for emotional architecture. Well, it turns out that emotional architecture came from theater. It was an idea that they brought from theater. And the person who they borrowed this idea from was a man from Japan called Seki Sano. And Seki Sano had to leave Japan, and he went to Russia, and he studied with Stanislavski, and then was involved in politics and had to flee Russia and ended up in Mexico. And it turns out that this man, Seki Sano, trained every single Golden Age Mexican actor and actress, and every single classic Mexican film that you see has Seki Sano's imprint. So that connection just absolutely blows my mind. A lot of people don't know that most of Seki Sano's ideas were coming from Russia. But if you see, I don't know how much you know about Mexican Golden Age films, but say Pedro Infante, like all these, I mean, it's like saying like Hollywood films have something to do with whatever you think is most distant. Well, Mexico is full of those examples. So thinking about your previous question, about what it does to translation, to be thinking about this moment in particular, I was also thinking of other things. For instance, one of my favorite poets from Argentina is Alejandra Pizarnik. Her parents were Jewish Ukrainians. No one ever connects Alejandra Pizarnik's work to the work of Ukrainian poets. Why? Because there are no Ukrainian poets translated into Spanish. So instead, people think of her in national terms. They think in terms of the Spanish language, her affiliations with Octavio Paz, with all these people. But what if, someone started researching how much she learned from her parents and what she was reading when she was a child, and maybe we discover that there's all these communicating vessels between Alejandra Pizarnik's poetry, who's the most influential female poet of South America by far, and Ukrainian culture, right? So I'm very interested in all these communicating vessels that keep getting eclipsed and not talked about because of nationalism, the nation state, and all these ideas that we're so familiar with. You're welcome.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I'm just conscious of time. Can we just a little longer, right? One last question to you all. I like that story that connects Russia, Mexico, and Japan. And we also had a Japanese poet, American poet with Japanese region, Sokolov, in our group in Armenia. And this is something that I would probably bring as a message of hope in this dark times we're living in. That community that we build, maybe, yes, it is just, 20 people, but it is larger than just a number 20. That would be my message of hope, and what all of you can because I don't want to finish the panel with the gloomy thoughts about war that it could be, but like something that we can be hopeful about.
I think Monica's replica response was kind of perfect. My hope is that work of people of letters allows us to seek different connections. And again, this laboratory, this translation publication project, which is more than 20 people, because many people came to listen at the readings, many people bought the book, and so on. It's kind of growing. But again, this very idea, when there is so much disconnection, translators connect.
I am actually hoping that the project will in some way continue. And the analogy of its effects over time that I have is I had the luck once, unfortunately only once, to study Latin in Rome with Reginaldus. Reginaldus, who is no longer alive, was one of the 4 papal Latinists who, in the summer, as a mitzvah, taught Latin to whoever wanted to come. He did this for decades. He was completely amazing because Latin to him was a living language. He spoke to you in Latin. His friends would come over and speak to you in Latin. As a result, there are hundreds of classicists and non-classicists all over the world who have been, trained by Reginaldos, who did this program sometimes for one summer like I did, but sometimes for like 10, 15 summers, who are changing the teaching of classical languages, at least in this country, okay? So this is, it's a kind of institution which in case of Latin just started with one person deciding I'm going to do this over the summer. Of having a very, very large effect.
It is a good question, Polina. Sort of a tough one. I do not think that literature carries any message of hope, but I do think that reading does. And I think that the act of the translation is importantly an act of reading that generates readings, generates readers. So maybe the hope that there be is the hope that connections grow. Monica's example is beautiful of Stanislavski's influence on Mexican cinema. And I love that you brought up Hollywood because what Sekesana was to Mexican cinema, Richard Boleslavsky was to classical Hollywood. The Stanislavski student who emigrated and taught classical Hollywood film actors in exactly the same way. But we also know this from poetry, we also know this from other arts. So perhaps this is the message. The message is that we create new versions, create new worlds, and this hasn't been brought up, but let me emphasize this. The part of the translation project we're talking about today was the second part, where Anglophone American authors were being translated into Russian, not in Russian. This is very important. This is about the carriage, the passage of culture into a language other than its own, not into English as the lingua franca. This is an act that resists the idea that to be global, to be public, the poet must be available in English, because if she is not translated into English, she does not exist. No, we also want to read them in Armenian, in Spanish, and in Russian, including in the Russian that is not being produced in the Russian Federation.
So true. I always had the sense that what we were doing was deeply subversive for that reason, right? And just knowing the technicalities of the people having to return to Russia and the things they needed to take care of, their cards, etc., like really gave me a clearer sense of what it entailed. Very briefly, two things. We've been all talking about this, but Ars Longa, Vita Brevis. This is an episode in history, in geopolitical history, that will end at some point because nobody is eternal so far. And
thank God.
Thank God, nobody is eternal. And what we have done and what we leave behind is there to be reinterpreted, reread, grappled with, and hopefully, it's the basis for a different script, a different story. And also just what certainly translation reveals is that nothing is definitive. Nothing is definitive, and nothing is there's no unilateral meaning that can be imposed on any particular text. So that notion that everything can be redefined collectively is, to me, actually quite hopeful at this time.